By 1945, the most destructive conflict in human history had finally ended, leaving the great empires of Europe and Asia in smoldering ruins. Out of this massive geopolitical void, only two global powers remained standing to claim the future. The United States and the Soviet Union now faced each other across a broken map, sitting down to carve up the shattered globe. But neither side wanted to start a third world war with tanks and trenches. Instead, they would fight over the very blueprints for how human society should operate. On one side was Soviet communism. Rooted in the 19th century writings of German philosopher Karl Marx, this system emerged as a reaction to the extreme poverty created by the Industrial Revolution. The state would seize the means of production, outlaw private property, and attempt to mandate total economic equality for the working class. Opposing them was American capitalism, a system built on private ownership, free markets, and individual political self-determination. Here, citizens voted for their leaders and freely bought and sold goods for profit. Looking at this map of how these two economies expand, you can see why they collided. Capitalist economies require constant access to raw materials and expanding international trade networks to thrive. Communist ideology demands the exact opposite, the global elimination of the capitalist class to secure its own survival. Because both models depended on continuous outward expansion to survive, their interests clashed in every corner of the globe. This friction fueled a mutual paranoia that eventually split Europe behind a rigid iron curtain. Direct combat between these two giants was off the table, thanks to the invention of the atomic bomb. Both nations quickly stockpiled enough thermonuclear weapons to wipe out humanity entirely, creating a hostage situation known as mutually assured destruction. To win without firing a shot, American policymakers developed a strategy called containment. If they could simply stop Soviet ideology from expanding into new territories, they theorized the communist system would eventually collapse under its own weight. The primary weapon of containment was cash. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States pumped almost $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe, banking on the idea that prosperous, well-fed citizens rarely start communist revolutions. The Soviet Union hit back by funding socialist uprisings in vulnerable countries and locking down Eastern Europe. They forced neighboring nations into a rigid military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact, creating a massive territorial buffer zone. This ideological gridlock soon manifested in concrete and barbed wire, physically splitting the city of Berlin and the continent of Europe into two hostile halves. With Europe frozen in a stalemate, the battleground shifted south. As European empires dissolved, dozens of newly independent nations emerged across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, transforming regional disputes into devastating proxy wars. The superpowers poured money and weapons into these local conflicts. In Korea, over 2 million people died to end in a border stalemate. In Vietnam, America spent over a decade fighting a grueling, televised quagmire that ended in defeat and over 3 million total casualties. Watching these horrific, unwinnable conflicts play out on evening news broadcasts shattered public trust. Across the Western world, millions of politicized youths took to the streets to protest. Paranoia drove both sides to abandon their stated ideals, repeatedly toppling democratically elected leaders and funding brutal military dictators simply to keep territories out of enemy hands. By 1962, this shadow war reached a breaking point. These surveillance satellites proved that the Soviet Union had covertly placed nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida, triggering a 13-day standoff that brought both nations to the absolute edge of a direct exchange. Reaching these strategic goals required proving system superiority to the rest of the world. This made technological milestones, like launching the first satellites or sending humans into orbit, crucial propaganda tools used to market each ideology as the peak of human achievement. After a decade of frantic investment and engineering, the United States captured the ultimate psychological victory by landing the first human on the moon. Unable to confront each other in direct combat, Washington and Moscow utilized every available metric of human achievement, from Olympic medals to space exploration, in an unrelenting contest for supremacy. By the 1980s, the internal mechanics of the Soviet command economy were failing. Central planners in Moscow couldn't accurately dictate the price of every good, leading to severe shortages, a massive drop in revenue, and a complete lack of technological innovation. Meanwhile, Western economies were booming. To exploit this widening gap, the United States dramatically increased its defense spending, forcing the already fragile Soviet economy to break its back trying to keep up in a renewed arms race. Desperate to save the system, a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduced radical reforms. He allowed limited free market mechanics to operate under a policy called perestroika and encouraged political transparency through a policy known as glasnost. But glasnost worked too well. Encouraging open debate exposed decades of government corruption, lethal mismanagement, and economic rot. By relaxing state censorship, Gorbachev accidentally dissolved the atmosphere of fear that kept the Eastern Bloc compliant. Realizing the Soviet military would no longer crush them, citizens across Eastern Europe rose up in a rapid cascade of democratic revolutions in 1989. Within months, the Berlin Wall was torn down by the very people it was built to contain. The momentum was unstoppable. On Christmas Day in 1991, Gorbachev officially resigned, terminating the existence of the Soviet Union as it splintered into 15 independent states. The Cold War demonstrated that a disagreement over economic blueprints could drive the world's most powerful nations toward a suicide pact. While the Soviet model collapsed, the era left behind a global map defined by the specific divisions and proxy alliances forged during those 40 years of conflict.